In the fevered summer of 1833, near Córdoba, Veracruz, a cruel hacienda master would one day hand his own daughter, born with dwarfism and hidden upstairs in shame, to an enslaved blacksmith as though he were throwing away spoiled grain. Stay with me, because before this night of disgrace arrives, you must see the house that raised that cruelty, and the young woman it could not crush. The ingenio of San Jerónimo woke before the sun. Cane smoke and tolling bells rolled over the fields, while men stumbled toward the mill in the half-dark, their shirts wet before morning had properly begun. From the long gallery of the main house, Don Genaro Escandon stood with a glass of fortified wine in his hand, watching the cutters below as if their breath belonged to him. He had the hard face of a man who believed land could forgive any sin committed upon it. But the sin that lived closest to him did not stand in the fields. It lived above his own head. Her name was Serafina. She was his only child, small in body, sharp in mind, and kept out of sight whenever visitors crossed the courtyard. If merchants came, she was locked upstairs. If a priest arrived, she was told to keep silent. If laughter rose below, it died at her door. The servants whispered that the girl had done nothing except survive the birth that killed her mother, and for that alone her father had never forgiven her. Only one person climbed those stairs without fear, old Tia Sinforosa. Warm hands smelling of cinnamon, wood smoke, and masa carried trays, gossip, and mercy to the hidden room. She knew what Don Genaro refused to see. The child he concealed like family shame was already becoming the one person in that house who could read souls and numbers. If this story has already taken hold of your heart, subscribe now, because the first pages Serafina read in secret were the beginning of everything. Those secret pages did not reach Serafina by accident. Every Thursday, when the office shutters were opened to let out the smell of ink, sweat, and damp paper, Tia Sinforosa found a reason to pass through with chocolate for the clerk or bread for the administrator. She moved slowly, like an old woman with tired knees, but her eyes missed nothing. A folded scrap left near the scales, a copied column tucked beneath a tray, a whole leaf slipped under the napkin basket. Bit by bit, the house that kept the girl hidden upstairs in shame fed her the truth of its own corruption. By candlelight, Serafina spread the pages on a cedar chest and studied them with a patience that would have humbled any bookkeeper in Veracruz. Her fingers, small and steady, ran over columns of sugar loads, mule hire, iron tools, advances to laborers, barrels sent to market, money that vanished between one hand and the next. She could see where numbers had been fattened like diseased fruit. She could see where debt had been dressed in clean handwriting and called profit. The administrator thought himself clever. Don Genaro thought himself feared enough to remain blind forever. She was neither blind nor frightened of figures. In that cramped room, with the night air pressing hot against the shutters, she kept a second account in a school notebook bound in worn blue cloth. The forge and the ledger. That was how the estate truly breathed, though she did not yet know how closely those two things would one day be tied together. Sinforosa watched her in silence for a while, then set down a cup of anise tea and said very softly, "Your mother had the same way of looking at a lie." Serafina raised her head. Because in that house the dead woman's name was never spoken aloud, and the old cook had just opened the door to a memory long forbidden. Sinforosa did not speak again at once. She stood by the shutter, listening to the far groan of the mill and the faint scrape of branches against the wall. Then she crossed herself, as old women do when memory feels too close to the grave, and turned back to Serafina with wet eyes. "Your mother," she said, "was called Doña Jacinta in public, but in private she laughed like a village girl. She smelled of orange blossom water and ink. She kept her own keys, and your father never forgave her for having a mind." The old cook spoke softly, yet every word fell heavy. On the night Serafina was born, rain hammered the tiles until the gutters overflowed. The labor went on for hours, candles burned low, sheets were changed and changed again. By dawn, the child had cried, the mother had gone pale as chapel wax, and Don Genaro had entered the room with the face of a man cheated by God. Later, 2 physicians sent from Puebla told him plainly that the baby's condition was no curse, no punishment, no infection to fear. He heard them, and chose his pride instead. Sinforosa pressed her palm against her apron, as if she could still feel the blood of that long-ago morning. He did not weep for her. He did not thank heaven for you. He walked out before her body was cold. Serafina lowered her eyes to the notebook in her lap. For years she had guessed. Hearing it spoken was different. Grief, once nameless, took shape like a figure stepping out of fog. Then Sinforosa added something stranger still. In the days before the birth, Doña Jacinta had begun hiding small things, letters, receipts, a ring she never wore. She had said, more than once, "If the child lives, she must have what is hers." And when Serafina looked up, the old woman was already reaching inside her blouse for a key she had concealed for 18 years. The key was small, dark with age, and warm from the old woman's skin. Sinforosa closed Serafina's fingers around it and led her, not toward the great rooms below, but to a narrow passage behind the upper corridor where lime dust gathered in the corners and the air smelled of old cedar and trapped summers. Few people remembered that passage. Fewer still knew where it ended. At the back of it stood a short door, half hidden by a broken screen and a rolled carpet stiff with neglect. When the lock turned, it gave a dry little sigh, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. Inside lay a disused linen room, trunks, moth-eaten curtains, cracked sinks prints, and a cradle pushed against the wall. Serafina felt something tighten in her chest at the sight of it. Sinforosa went straight to a cedar coffer bound in tarnished brass. Beneath folded infant blankets and yellowed lace, there were smaller things wrapped in cloth. A woman's ivory comb with 2 missing teeth, a sealed packet of household receipts, a silver thimble, and a tiny pair of baby shoes, never worn outdoors. The smell rising from the trunk was faint but unmistakable. Lavender, dry paper, and time. These were kept back before he began ordering everything burned or inventoried, the old cook murmured. Your mother trusted no one in the last weeks except me. Serafina touched the comb as if it might answer her. Then she opened the packet. The receipts were in her mother's hand, neat and firm. Purchases of lamp oil, apothecary charges, alms sent quietly to a widow in the workers' quarter. Small sums, honest sums. A woman who counted carefully, a woman who planned. At the very bottom of the coffer, tucked under the cradle linen, Serafina found a half-finished letter with no name on the outside, and a line that made the blood leave her face. The line was short, but it struck like cold iron. If he turns against my child, let the church keep what blood must not. That was what Doña Jacinta had written in the unfinished letter. The ink thinned at the end as if her hand had weakened before she could finish the thought. Serafina read it twice, then a third time, with her lips parted and her breath gone shallow. She knew at once the words were about her father. Sinforosa knew it too. The old woman did not interrupt. She only watched, one hand pressed over the cross at her throat. There was more in the packet. A merchant's receipt from Veracruz for gold exchanged into smaller pieces, a note for altar embroidery delivered to the chapel sacristy, a careful list in Jacinta's hand naming candles, lace, and thread, though Serafina could feel the hidden shape beneath the list. These were not household expenses alone. They were steps, quiet steps. A woman preparing against betrayal, while still living under the same roof as the man who would betray her. Sinforosa sat on the old cradle and lowered her voice to a whisper. In her last month, she spent longer than usual in the chapel. She said prayer calmed her, but she carried a sewing case every time. I thought she was making a vow mantle for one of the saints. After she died, your father searched her writing desk, her wardrobes, even the nursery chest. He found nothing. That frightened him more than grief ever could. Serafina gathered the papers, her mind already moving faster than her pulse. If her mother had hidden money, she had hidden it where a proud man would look with impatience, not reverence. Then, from somewhere below, cane smoke and tolling bells gave way to another sound. Wheels in the courtyard, chains striking wood, and men shouting at the gate. The noise below swallowed the quiet of the linen room in an instant. Serafina gathered the papers against her chest while Sinforosa blew out the candle with her fingers and cracked the door just enough to look. From the courtyard rose the harsh music of arrival, mule harness creaking, boots striking stone, a cart axle complaining under too much weight, and voices sharpened by command. There was a smell, too, thick and ugly, pushing even through the corridor. Brine, sweat, old fear, and iron. "Stay back," Sinforosa whispered. But Serafina had already gone to the narrow lattice above the inner patio, the one place where someone hidden upstairs in shame could watch the world without being seen by it. Beneath her, men were being unloaded from 2 covered wagons. Their wrists were linked with chain, their clothes hung in strips. One had dried blood on his temple, another could barely stand. Don Genaro was there in his riding coat, speaking with a broad man in sea-worn boots whose beard was salted white around the chin. The servants would later say he came from the coast under false papers. Serafina did not need their gossip to know the trade was foul. She could see it in the way money changed hands quickly, and eyes refused to linger. Then she noticed one of the chained men. He was taller than the rest, though the journey had bent his shoulders with exhaustion. His skin gleamed dark beneath dust. His hands, even bound, told their own history. Burned knuckles, thick palms, the square fingers of a craftsman. When one guard shoved an older captive aside, that man shifted just enough to steady him without drawing a blow to himself. It was a small movement, yet full of discipline. Sinforosa came to Serafina's side and breathed almost soundlessly. "That one has worked with fire." Below them, Don Genaro pointed toward the outbuildings. The man lifted his head. That lifted face stayed with Serafina long after the courtyard emptied. By supper, the whole house had changed its breathing. Servants spoke low. The clerk drank faster than usual. Don Genaro shut himself in the office with the coastal trader and the administrator, and their voices leaked beneath the door like sour smoke. From the kitchen passage, Sinforosa gathered enough to piece together the worst of it. The man in sea boots had delivered human cargo through hidden landings and back roads. Payment had been made in silver, sugar notes, and future harvests that did not yet exist. Even in her father's wickedness, there was desperation now. Near dusk, Serafina slipped to the rear gallery where she could see the work sheds. The new men were being divided like tools. 2 were sent to the cane carts, 1 to the mule yard. The tall one with the smith's hands was dragged toward the forge, where the air always shimmered red and the ground smelled of coal, hot iron, and old burns. A foreman with a split lip struck him between the shoulders and laughed when he staggered. Then came the insult that told Serafina exactly what kind of theft this was. The foreman asked his name. The man answered in a tongue she did not know, low and steady despite exhaustion. The overseer spat, said it was too thick for Christian mouths, and declared that from this night forward he would be called Melchor. Just like that, a life was cut in 2 with one lazy word. The man did not bow his head. He only looked once toward the dying light beyond the cane, as if measuring distance. Serafina felt anger rise in her throat, sharp as vinegar. The next morning, before the bell for first labor had finished ringing, she heard shouting from the forge. Melchor had already done something no one expected. By the time Serafina reached the rear stair again, the shouting had sharpened into rage. She went to the same narrow opening above the work sheds and looked down into a morning already bruised by heat. At the forge yard, the foreman had put a leather whip into Melchor's hand and shoved a younger captive to his knees before him. The lesson was plain enough for anyone to understand. Break another man, and you may keep a little skin on your own back. Around them, the air wavered above the coals. Hammer smoke, sweat, and wet earth after the night dew rose together until breathing itself felt heavy. Melchor looked at the whip. Then he looked at the kneeling man. He did not raise his arm. The foreman barked at him once, then again, louder. A second overseer laughed and struck the kneeling captive across the face, perhaps to stir the blacksmith into obedience. Still, Melchor did not move. At last he let the whip fall into the dust between his feet. It was a small sound, almost nothing, but in that yard it landed like a challenge thrown before a judge. What followed came fast and ugly. The foreman hit him in the ribs with a stick. Another man drove a fist into his mouth. When Melchor bent under the blows, they tied his wrists to a post beside the coal bin and beat him there for all to see. Serafina gripped the lattice so hard the wood bit her palms. She waited for him to cry out, to beg, to curse. He did none of those things. He held himself upright as long as he could, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the yard, beyond the house, beyond every hand that claimed to own him. When they finally cut him down, they dragged him toward the old storage hut near the forge. Serafina, trembling from head to foot, turned to find Sinforosa already standing behind her, holding a basin, bandages, and a jar of salve. Sinforosa had already decided before Serafina found words. "There is still light in the yard," the old cook murmured. "We wait until the last lamp at the office goes dark." She set the basin on the table, unwrapped clean strips of linen she had stolen from the ironing room, and opened the clay jar. The salve smelled of tallow, crushed marigold, and bitter leaves from the kitchen garden. Serafina knew every ingredient by touch. She had learned them in scraps, the way hidden girls learn most things, from corners, whispers, and women who are never thanked. Night came slowly over the ingenio. Cane smoke drifted low. A dog barked once near the mule pens, then fell silent. From below rose the clink of bottles and a burst of drunken laughter from Don Genaro's office. At last, when even that died away, Sinforosa wrapped a dark shawl over Serafina's shoulders and led her down the back stair, past the pantry, across the damp stones behind the washhouse, and toward the old storage hut by the forge. Inside, the air was close and hot, full of soot, blood, and old iron. Melchor lay on a pile of sacking in the corner, wrists swollen, shirt torn open across the back. For one breath, Serafina stopped at the threshold. He was larger up close than he had seemed from above, his silence heavier too. Yet when she knelt beside him and dipped the cloth into the basin, her hands steadied. He opened his eyes as the water touched his skin. They were dark, alert, and full of pain he would not voice. He tried to rise. She pressed one small hand gently to his shoulder and whispered, "Do not move. I came to help." He did not understand every word. She could see that at once. But when Sinforosa set the lamp higher, Melchor looked from the old cook to Serafina, and his gaze changed, as if he had recognized something impossible. For a moment, none of them spoke. The lamp flame trembled in the hot air, throwing gold over the blackened wall, over the basin, over the torn flesh across his back. Melchor's eyes moved slowly over Serafina's face, her small hands, the dark shawl around her shoulders. Fever and pain had drained him, yet there was still caution in him, bright and awake. He looked like a man who had been taught by life that kindness often arrives wearing a trap. Sinforosa knelt first and touched her own chest. "Friend," she said, then pointed to Serafina. "Friend." The old woman's voice was low and patient, the way one calms a frightened horse in a storm. Melchor's gaze did not soften, but it steadied. When Serafina pressed the clean cloth to one of the worst welts, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped near his temple. Still, he did not pull away. "You will have to bear it," she whispered, more to keep her own courage in place than because he understood. She cleaned each stripe carefully, lifting away soot, dirt, and thin ribbons of blood. The skin beneath was swollen and hot. Sinforosa passed her the salve. Serafina spread it with gentle fingers, feeling the heat of him, the roughness of scars older than this place. Those scars troubled her. They spoke of roads, ships, fires, and chains long before San Jeronimo had ever laid claim to him. At last he said one word. It was not Spanish. The sound was deep, worn at the edges, and to Serafina it seemed less like a question than a searching. She answered with the simplest truth she had. Serafina. He repeated it with effort, slowly, as if setting a fragile thing in place. Then he touched his own chest with 2 fingers and gave her the name they were trying to erase. The name hung between them like a coal that refused to die. Serafina tried to shape it with care, repeating the syllables just as he had given them. The sound was unfamiliar in her mouth, but she would not let it be mocked into nothing. Melchor listened, then gave the smallest nod, as if a torn piece of himself had been returned for one breath. Sinforosa, practical even in the middle of danger, touched Serafina's sleeve and reminded her they had little time before the watch changed. So they worked quickly. She bound his wrists where the rope had cut through skin. She pressed cool cloth to the bruise darkening along his jaw. When she lifted the basin again, he caught sight of her hands, narrow and strong, moving with the confidence of someone who had done more than embroidery in hidden rooms. His gaze drifted to the shelf behind her, where old tongs, broken nails, and rusted hinges lay in a heap. Then he looked back at her, at the way she measured the salve with 2 fingers, and no waste at all. He understood something then. This girl had been kept from the world, but not emptied by it. He spoke again, this time in halting Spanish, each word dragged up from somewhere deep and painful. Why? Serafina did not answer with softness. She answered with truth. Because they want you to forget you are a man. Her voice shook only at the end. And because I know what it is to be treated like a shame that must be hidden. Melchor held her eyes. Whatever lay behind his own had seen too much to trust easily, yet he did not turn away. Outside, a cart rattled past. Somewhere farther off, a mule screamed in its stall. Sinforosa stiffened, head tilted toward the door. Footsteps were coming across the yard, and they were stopping at the hut. Sinforosa moved before fear could root anyone to the floor. She snatched up the basin, kicked a rag over the bloodied cloths, and lowered the lamp wick until the hut sank into a dim amber hush. Serafina rose so quickly her knees stung. Melchor, though half broken by the beating, pushed himself upright against the wall and dragged the torn shirt across his shoulders. The footsteps stopped just outside. Then came a pause, a breath, and 2 soft knocks, nothing like the fist of an overseer. Sinforosa opened the door a hand's width. A boy slipped in sideways, thin as a cane stalk and shivering though the night was warm. Serafina knew him by sight from the mule yard. Tomas, one of the youngest hands, no more than 15, his cheek was swollen and his left ear had dried blood beneath it. He smelled of dust, mule sweat, and fear. I saw, he whispered to the old cook. They said the big one would die here. I brought water. Only then did he notice Serafina in the shadows, and his eyes widened. He dropped his gaze at once, not in contempt, but in confusion. Like most on the estate, he had heard of the master's daughter more as rumor than flesh. Serafina took the jug from him. Why risk this? The boy swallowed. Because he would not strike Mateo. Those words changed the air inside the hut. Melchor understood only part of it, but he caught the name of the kneeling captive, and something passed across his face, heavy and quiet. Tomas, emboldened by the silence, took one hesitant step closer. There are others hurt too, he said. One in the carts, one in the boiling room. Nobody dares ask for help. Sinforosa looked at Serafina. Serafina looked at Melchor. Outside, beyond the dark yard, cane smoke and tolling bells drifted through the night, as if the whole estate were listening for the answer. Serafina answered before caution could stop her. "Bring them one at a time," she told Tomas. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, yet firm enough that both the boy and the wounded man understood the decision had already been made. Sinforosa gave her a hard look, the kind old women use when they know mercy can become a road with no end. Still, she said nothing. She only set the lamp near the wall and began tearing more strips from an old underskirt. The first to come was Matteo, the kneeling captive Melchor had refused to strike. Tomas slipped him through the yard by the back of the ash pit, where the ground stayed black and soft enough to swallow footsteps. Matteo's lip was split, one eye nearly closed, and the side of his neck bore the angry mark of a lash tip. When Melchor saw him, something in his whole battered frame changed. He reached out at once, speaking low in his own language, the words rough but tender. Matteo answered with a choked sound that needed no translation. Serafina cleaned the cut beneath his eye. Melchor, with one hand still shaking from pain, showed her how to brace the man's jaw so he would not pull away when the sting came. It was the first lesson between them, given over blood and lamplight. Sinforosa noticed, so did Serafina. By midnight, 2 more had come, a cart driver with a crushed thumb wrapped in filthy cloth, a sugar boiler with a burn climbing red and wet across his forearm. The hut by the forge no longer felt like a hiding place. It had become something else. A secret room where the broken were treated like human beings. When the last one left, Melchor looked at Serafina for a long moment and said in careful Spanish, "You know healing." Before she could answer, voices rose from the yard again, and this time one of them belonged to Don Genaro. At the sound of her father's voice, the whole hut seemed to shrink. Sinforosa snatched the empty jug from Tomas and shoved the boy behind a stack of charcoal sacks. Serafina had only one place to go. Melchor, understanding danger before language, caught her wrist and guided her toward the narrow space between the wall and a leaning rack of scrap iron. It smelled of rust, ash, and old rain trapped in wood. She pressed herself there, heart hammering so hard she feared the sound alone would betray them. The door opened without warning. Don Genaro entered with the administrator and one lantern between them. The flame threw wild shadows across the floorboards. Serafina could see only her father's boots at first, polished even at that hour, and the hem of his coat brushing soot. "Still alive," he said with lazy disgust. "Good. I paid too much for a man who refuses to be useful." The administrator muttered that the blacksmith's hands were worth money if kept whole. There was talk of broken gear at the mill, cart rims needing repair, chains to mend. Then the conversation turned uglier. Don Genaro laughed and said a stubborn beast could always be taught with hunger, or with someone weaker placed in his care. In the shadows, Serafina felt her blood go cold. Melchor sat motionless on the pallet, eyes lowered, as if he understood nothing. Yet one of his hands had shifted behind the hanging cloth near Serafina's hiding place, covering the edge of her skirt from lantern light. It was such a small act, almost invisible. Still, she felt it like a vow spoken without words. The men stayed only a minute longer. Before leaving, Don Genaro ordered that Melchor be put to the forge at dawn and watched closely. Then the lantern light withdrew, the door shut, and from the yard came the administrator's last low sentence, one Serafina was never meant to hear. "Señor, the debts are worse than you think." The sentence from the yard did not leave Serafina for the rest of the night. After Tomas slipped away and Sinforosa barred the hut again, the girl sat on an overturned bucket with the lamp between her and Melchor, hearing the administrator's warning repeat in her mind like a spoon striking a cracked cup. The debts are worse than you think. She knew at once it was true. The pages hidden in her room had already shown her false entries, missing loads, wages withheld on paper and stolen in practice. But hearing it from the man who kept the official books gave the danger a new shape. Her father was sinking. Melchor watched her face as if he could not catch every word, yet could read the weight of them. Serafina set a charcoal nub against a scrap of wrapping paper and drew quick columns, then marks for sugar, tools, mule feed, and freight. She showed him how the same barrel could be counted twice, how a debt could be pushed into another month, how a liar hid hunger behind pretty lines. His eyes sharpened. Then he took the charcoal from her and drew his own signs: a wheel rim, a broken chain, a furnace door, 3 hammer strokes. He tapped each one and shook his head. Repairs delayed, iron reused too long, work forced past safety. The forge and the ledger were telling the same story. Sinforosa crossed herself under her breath. When a rich man begins selling tomorrow to pay for yesterday, he grows more savage by the hour. Outside, dawn had not yet come, yet the first bell sounded early, wrong somehow, flat and hurried. Then came running feet, a woman's cry from the workers' quarters, and a word that made all 3 lift their heads at once. Fever. The words struck the hut harder than any knock at the door. Fever was no stranger on an estate, but this cry had a different edge to it. It ran through the pre-dawn dark like a blade through wet cloth. A woman wailed again from the workers' quarter. Then came the sound of someone retching, thin and helpless, followed by the hurried clatter of a bucket dropped on stone. Sinforosa was already moving. She wrapped a shawl over her hair, grabbed the water jug, and told Serafina to bring vinegar, clean rags, and the little packet of dried mint leaves from her apron pocket. When they stepped outside, the yard smelled wrong: sour sickness, spilled slop, and fear. 2 men were carrying a field hand between them, his feet dragging trenches in the dirt. His skin had gone gray around the mouth, his eyes rolled white. At the sight of him, the overseer cursed and shouted for the sick to be taken away from the main kitchens, as if distance alone could command death. Serafina knelt beside the stricken man before anyone could stop her. His pulse fluttered wildly under her fingers. His lips were dry, but sweat soaked his shirt. Melchor, still hurting, came out behind her with a steadiness that made even the mule boy stare. He said only a few words in rough Spanish, yet she understood. Boil water. Keep him shaded. Do not let the bucket from his pallet go back to the common well. She looked up at him sharply. He pointed toward the wells, then toward the mouths of the others gathering in panic. He knew this kind of danger. And across the yard, under the gallery where Don Genaro liked to drink, the administrator was hissing into his master's ear that if the sickness reached the house, certain locked papers and valuables must be moved at once. The whisper about locked papers and valuables lodged in Serafina's mind like a splinter. All morning the estate staggered between panic and denial. The sick field hand was dragged to a shaded lean-to near the cane carts. Women boiled water in dented pots. Men argued over which bucket had touched which hand. Don Genaro barked orders from the gallery, as though volume could command a fever to kneel. Through it all, Serafina watched the chapel path. If her father feared hidden valuables now, the old clues from her mother's papers took on a sharper shape. Near noon, Sinforosa came to her with flour on her forearms and alarm in her eyes. "He asked again," she murmured, "about any reserve your mother may have concealed. He sent the administrator to search the upstairs trunks 2 years ago. Today he spoke of the chapel." That last word made Serafina's breath catch. The 2 women found a moment alone in the back pantry, where dried peppers hung from the beams and the air smelled of garlic, dust, and hot stone. There, with the door half closed, Sinforosa finally told her what she had never dared say plainly. In Jacinta's last weeks, she had indeed carried a sewing case to the chapel. Not for piety alone. She had been altering the mantle of a small saint kept near the side altar, stitching something into its lining with her own hands. Gold, perhaps. Papers, perhaps. Enough to save a child if the house turned wolf. Serafina pressed both palms to the table. "Why did you never tell me?" "Because secrets kept a woman alive longer than prayers in this house," Sinforosa answered. and because once a man like your father smells hidden money, he tears walls apart." From the courtyard came another cry, this one sharper than the rest. The administrator had just discovered that someone had already entered the chapel that morning, and something there had been disturbed. Alarm from the courtyard pulled every eye toward the chapel. Servants came hurrying with aprons still dusted in flour. A sacristan's helpers stammered that one of the side altar cloths had been tugged loose, and the little plaster saint beside the votive shelf was tilted forward, as if someone had touched it in haste. Don Genaro swore under his breath and strode across the stones with the administrator at his shoulder. Serafina followed at a distance, head covered, carrying a basin as though she belonged to the line of women sent to wash the sick. In houses like that, dear listener, invisibility was often the last freedom left to the despised. Inside, the chapel smelled of old wax, damp lime, and wilting lilies. The air was cooler there. Even panic lowered its voice before the altar. Serafina kept her gaze on the floor, but she saw everything. The small saint Sinforosa had described stood where the candles guttered on a side shelf, its embroidered mantle hanging slightly crooked. Someone had searched clumsily and lost patience. Her father, she thought at once. A proud man pawing at holy cloth with hands that had never learned reverence. Don Genaro slapped the altar rail and demanded to know who had entered. No one answered. The administrator muttered that if valuables had been hidden in church vestments, they must be removed before sickness or theft spread through the estate. That phrase reached Serafina like a thrown stone. Must be removed. Soon, today, if possible. When they left, she lingered only long enough to set the basin down and straighten a fallen candle cup. Her fingers brushed the saint's mantle for the briefest instant. Beneath the stiff embroidery, she felt it. A hard seam where no seam should be. That night, she knew, they would have only one chance. When she slipped back to the forge hut to tell Melchor, she found him already waiting with a length of wire, a coal sack, and a plan of his own. Melchor had been thinking ahead while the rest of the estate drowned in fear. On the floor of the hut, with a bit of charcoal and the flat side of a broken crate, he drew what he had watched since arriving. The path from the forge to the ash pit, the side door of the chapel, the line of shadows cast after sunset by the west wall, and the place where the night watch liked to stop for tobacco when the bell for Compline was done. His Spanish was still rough, but his hands spoke clearly. If Sinforosa kept one overseer busy with talk of the sick in the workers' quarter, and if Tomas rattled the mule gate at the right time, the chapel could be entered for only a minute, maybe two. Serafina watched him, amazed by the calm precision of a man everyone else thought broken. He pointed to the coal sack, then to the little saint's height with his palm. The mantle could be hidden inside the sack, carried out as if it were scraps for the furnace. Afterward, if the cloth held what her mother had sewn there, they would open it only in private. Sinforosa listened, lips pressed thin. "If we are caught," she said, "he will bury the truth with us." "He already means to," Serafina answered. Outside, the fever had spread from one pallet to three. Water simmered in kettles. People crossed themselves with trembling hands. Don Genaro kept shouting for order while the administrator locked ledgers and keys in the office chest. Through the cracked door, Serafina caught one more thing. Her father had ordered the small chapel saint removed at dawn for inspection. Dawn. That one word turned a dangerous plan into a desperate one. When night finally fell, Sinforosa wrapped Serafina in a servant's shawl. Tomas took his place near the mules, and Melchor waited by the chapel wall with the coal sack at his feet. Then the bell began to ring, and someone else was already inside. The chapel door stood ajar, and light moved inside it like a trapped insect. Melchor flattened himself against the wall at once, one hand on the coal sack, the other lifted slightly to warn Serafina back. From where she stood in the shadow of the cistern, she could hear the bell rope still swaying above, giving little after-sounds into the night. Tomas, faithful child that he was, had already rattled the mule gate on cue. Somewhere across the yard, an overseer shouted in annoyance. But here, at the chapel, a different danger had arrived first. Sinforosa came around the corner carrying a bundle of rags, as if she were still only an old cook summoned by sickness. She saw the open door and stopped dead. Through the crack, they caught a glimpse of the administrator's lantern moving past the side altar. He was searching alone. Perhaps greed had made him secretive. Perhaps fear of Don Genaro had made him bold. Either way, Providence had not sent them an empty room. It had sent them a race. Melchor bent, picked up a pebble, and tossed it toward the far arcade. It struck a water jar with a sharp pop. At once, the lantern inside paused. The administrator muttered, stepped back, and went to peer into the dark outside the chapel. In that tiny turning of his body, the side altar was left unguarded. Serafina did not think. She moved. Small feet made little sound on old tile. She slipped through the door, past the rail, past the wax smell and the wilt of day-old flowers, straight to the plaster saint. Her fingers found the crooked mantle seam at once. It was stiff with old thread. She worked the wire under it, hands trembling. Behind her, the administrator said, "Who's there?" Under the embroidery, something hard and narrow slid at last against her fingertips. Serafina closed her fingers around the hidden object and turned just as the administrator lifted the lantern. For one terrible second, the light found her face, the saint's crooked mantle, and the wire still caught in the seam. His mouth opened. He knew her as the hidden daughter who should not have been in the chapel at such an hour. Before he could call out, Melchor moved with the speed of a man who had measured danger long before it came. He stepped through the doorway, seized the hanging bell rope, and yanked with all his strength. The chapel exploded with sound. The bell crashed overhead so violently that the administrator flinched and threw up an arm. Wax cups rattled. A pigeon burst from the rafters in a panic of wings. Outside, voices answered at once, confused and alarmed, all talking over one another. Sinforosa, blessed old actress that she was, let out a cry from the yard that one of the fevered had collapsed by the well. Tomas began shouting for water. In that storm of noise, Serafina slipped the object into the coal sack Melchor had dropped at her feet. It was heavier than paper, lighter than a brick, wrapped in stiff cloth, long and flat. The administrator lunged blindly toward them, but Melchor shoved the side table into his path. The lantern swung wild, splashing light over saints' faces and whitewashed wall. Serafina darted low beneath his arm and reached the door. Sinforosa caught her by the elbow and thrust the coal sack into her hands as if it were kitchen rubbish. "Walk," the old woman hissed. "Only guilty people run." So Serafina walked, head bowed, sack against her skirts, while the whole courtyard reeled around the false emergency. She had almost reached the shadow of the forge when Don Genaro's voice thundered from the gallery above. "Stop that girl!" The command cracked across the courtyard like a whip. Serafina did not run. Sinforosa had warned her, and fear itself taught the same lesson. She stopped where she was, the coal sack hanging from one hand, her head bowed like any servant caught in someone else's uproar. Above her, Don Genaro leaned over the gallery rail in his nightshirt and coat, face shiny with drink and heat. Behind him, the administrator burst from the chapel door, red with fury, shouting about intrusion, theft, and sacrilege all at once. "Bring her here," her father said. The yard seemed to hold its breath. Cane smoke and tolling bells drifted from somewhere far off, thin now beneath the smell of sickness and spilled lamp oil. Melchor had vanished back into shadow so cleanly that only Serafina knew where to look for him. Tomas stood frozen by the mule fence. Sinforosa shuffled forward, making herself small, harmless, old. "Signor," the old woman said, "the girl carried rags for the sick. Nothing more." Don Genaro's gaze dropped at last to the sack in Serafina's hand. "Then empty it." Her fingers tightened. Inside the cloth bundle, she could feel the hidden weight pressing against her thigh through the coal dust. If she obeyed, the truth her mother had buried against treachery would spill out under torchlight. If she refused, she would condemn them all in a single gesture. Then, from the workers' quarter, A new cry tore through the night. Not fever this time. Fire. One of the boiling sheds had caught, maybe from a tipped lamp, maybe from panic, maybe by God's own dark timing. Sparks leapt orange against the black sky. Men shouted for water, mules screamed and kicked at their stalls. Don Genaro jerked around toward the blaze, cursing. The administrator did too. In that one breath of confusion, Melchor's voice came low out of the dark behind Serafina. "No. Come." She moved the instant he said it. Melchor's hand found her elbow through the smoke and pulled her toward the forge wall, away from the open yard where every shout still pointed toward the fire. The boiling shed was fully burning now. Sparks flew up like furious insects. Men ran with sloshing buckets. One mule had broken loose and was dragging its rope through the dust. Above all of it came the sour, punishing smell of sickness, wet ash, and sugar beginning to scorch. When an estate starts to crack, my friends, it does not split in one place only. It breaks everywhere at once. Sinforosa covered their retreat the way only a woman trained by years of danger can do. She stumbled into the center of the yard, crying that the fevered needed space, that no one must crowd the well, that the boiling room might take the next roof if the men kept yelling instead of hauling water. Tomas darted between legs with a bucket and made himself look busy. Don Genaro shouted 3 different orders to 3 different men, and none of them listened. For the first time in his life, command was leaving him. Inside the forge hut, Melchor kicked the door shut. Serafina dropped the coal sack onto the table, hands black with dust and shaking so badly she could hardly untie the knot. He did it for her, careful even in haste. Out came a folded packet wrapped in waxed cloth, and beneath it, thin gold pieces sewn flat between 2 layers of old lining. When Sinforosa slipped in after them and saw it, she made the sign of the cross with trembling fingers. "Your mother," she whispered. "She did it." But Melchor had already gone still, listening. From outside came the thunder of boots, the crash of a kicked bucket, and Don Genaro's voice, closer now, raw with suspicion. He was coming straight for the hut. When Don Genaro burst through the door, he found the hut already emptying itself of his power. The fire had spread to the roofline of the boiling shed. Fever had taken 2 more laborers. Men were shouting over one another, and nobody listened when he ordered them back into line. In that torn-open hour, Melchor led Serafina and Sinforosa through the ash trench behind the forge, past the mule pens, and out toward the old quarry track he had memorized from a dozen silent glances. Tomas ran with them as far as the mesquite brake, then pressed a skin of water into Serafina's hands and turned back before dawn could name him. By sunrise, the coal sack had been opened beneath a stand of scrub oak. Inside were the gold pieces, thin and real, and a sealed letter of credit in Jacinta's hand, meant for a merchant house beyond Córdoba. Sinforosa wept only once, quickly, then tied the packet back into cloth and said, "Now your mother walks with us." Behind them, San Jerónimo was left to its reckoning. Cholera finished what greed had weakened. Creditors came, locks were broken. Don Genaro, stripped of obedience, shouted at smoke and empty rooms. The books he had trusted more than mercy could no longer save him. By the time the fugitives reached the maroon town in the hills days later, they were taken in for use. Melchor's hands found the forge. Serafina's hands found the sick, the children, and the town ledger that needed honest numbers for the first time in years. Some things are hidden to be shamed. Some are hidden so they may survive the storm and come out carrying fire. In the evenings, when the forge cooled and the mountain air turned soft, the 2 of them would sit outside the doorway while hammered iron clicked gently as it lost its heat, and inside, the account book lay open under a clean lamp. If this story stayed with you, leave a word or a small sign below, and join me again for the next tale.